I hadn't intended that people join. I'm just doing a recording for purposes of putting it on our YouTube account. But it's really nice to have a little bit of an audience, so at least I know I'm not talking to the wall. So to kick off, I think that the talk will take just over an hour, depending on how fast or slow I go through it. But feel free to put up your hand and maybe ask questions at the end, and we can kick off. So I'm going to do a talk this evening about a family trip that I did with my wife and my 4 children to the southeastern parts of Brazil, around Sao Paulo and Rio. And this photo, as the title slide, epitomizes the type of trip we had. So these beautiful Atlantic rainforests, which are highly endangered, been destroyed at a very rapid rate. There's about 7% of the Atlantic rainforest remaining. And so there's a real last chance to see sort of feeling about a lot of the birds and certainly the vegetation that you see. There's quite a lot of evidence of the vegetation being chopped out. So this was a photo taken in Intervale State Park. And this is my son, Adam, photographing some really cool endemic birds. Right. Okay, so why did we pick Brazil? As a family, it seems like quite an exotic location for a family with a couple of kids. So we were due to go snow skiing in France 2020. We took the plunge and booked our first snow skiing trip as a family. And that obviously was scuppered due to COVID. And we were able to get a refund on that. And I decided that we should go somewhere a lot more interesting than somewhere where you don't see any birds. We, as a family, love doing adventurous road trips, and this certainly qualified from a number of perspectives. And I think the talk will highlight a few of those adventurous moments. Rio de Janeiro is one of the greatest cities in the world. And I have to sort of elaborate on this particular point, because when I was putting the trip together, my wife said to me that she's very excited to be going to Rio. And I said, well, the itinerary that I've picked out doesn't include Rio. And she put her foot down. She said, well, then I'm not coming. So I had to make some quick inquiries, and I had a look at the map of where we were going. And one of the sites, Itatiaia National Park, the place we were staying, when I put it into Google Maps, was about 170 kilometers from Rio. And I was absolutely delighted that we could do that short stretch to get to Rio and spend a couple of days there. And it was a huge game changer. I think it made the rest of the non-birding members of the family pretty excited. And it also ensured that we were able to continue with the plans. So we'd also never been to South America as a family. I'd been a couple of times on a few other birding trips, and it seemed like a good idea to tick that box. And most of our peers, friends and family that we knew, so many people were going to Greece for some reason. And we decided that we'd provide Brazil with some of our tourism rounds. And after quite a lot of drama around COVID, particularly for 2 years leading up to our trip, and certainly 6 months ahead of time, we hadn't confirmed our flights until Brazil pretty much dropped all its COVID regulations. We had to be vaccinated. My daughter, being under 12, didn't. But originally they required her to test going in and out, and then they dropped that requirement as well. So we certainly felt better booking very expensive flights without worrying too much about being kicked out of the country if we didn't meet all their COVID requirements. We actually we were required to have COVID vaccinations, but we were never asked for any vaccination certificates or even asked about COVID. In fact, we only had one guide who ahead of time asked us if it was okay for him not to wear a mask in the car. So I think it all worked quite well, and none of us got sick. So none of us could speak Portuguese. Obviously, 99% of the population of Brazil speak Portuguese. And my youngest son, Jack, decided about a month and a half before we left to start trying to learn how to speak Portuguese. And we thought it would be a good test for him to do it. We had quite a few amusing moments where he tested his Portuguese on us. And although he gave it his best, it's too short a time to learn such a complex language. So we had to make do, and I'll show you a slide or two on our plans. I think the most important reason why did we not go to France? There are pretty much no birds there, and there were tons of birds to see in Brazil. Right, so our itinerary was to head to Sao Paulo. And you'd think that that direct flight from Cape Town to Sao Paulo would be a good idea, but that wasn't possible. That flight was dropped about 2 years ago, I think, when COVID hit. So now we had to fly to Doha and then connect in Doha after 9.5 flight and then do a 15-hour flight to Sao Paulo. So it's a long way to travel. And initially I was very concerned about the long trip there and back for a relatively short time away. We were only in Brazil for about just over 2 weeks. But as it turned out, if you manage the flights in a certain way, you can get up and running as soon as you arrive, and just a few early nights helped us get over the jet lag. So that was us arriving in Sao Paulo. And as I said, we concentrated our trip in the southeastern corner of Brazil. And it was something that a lot of people asked us, are you going to the Amazon? And we said, well, I'd looked at getting to the Amazon, and to get to the Amazon, you have to travel up to Manaus in this area here. And that was going to be another sort of 4 or 5 hour flight. It was going to require us to spend another week, and it was going to be a lot more expensive. But there are incredible birds and birding sites in the southeastern part of Brazil. So these dark green patches are the Atlantic rainforests, and much of this coastline was completely covered, but a lot of it's been turned to pasture and eucalypt. But these areas are still pretty pristine from a Atlantic rainforest perspective. Okay, so this is how we did it. We landed in Sao Paulo Airport. We drove to Trilha dos Tucanos, and I'm going to spend some time on each place. Then it was Paraíso Eco Lodge, going further southwest. Then inland to a place called Fazenda Bacuri, which is an area of wetlands. They call it the mini Pantanal. The Pantanal is a huge wetland area, much further to the west inland in Brazil. It's a bit like our Okavango, but we didn't have time to go there. So the next best was to go to the Tanquas River. And then we had our longest stay to Itatiaia National Park, onto a hotel called Hotel do Ipe. And that was in the Serra do Mar mountain range. This is the Serra do Mar over here. You can see this mountain range over here. And Serra is mountains, and do Mar is of the sea. So it's mountains next to the sea. Then we did the bit that Jean really wanted to see, and that was to Rio de Janeiro, and then along to an island called Ilha Grande, which is this island over here. It's a little bit of a triangular shaped island. And then we had our last few days at a place called Ubatuba, which was amazing, and then back to Sao Paulo. So a few practical points. No one speaks English in Brazil. I think in our entire trip, we had maybe 5 people who sort of spoke English. We had one bird guide we met who was very fluent in English, but we only were chatting to him over dinner. He was guiding some other people, and we'll see him a little bit later in this presentation. But most people speak Portuguese, so we used an app called Translate, and we downloaded the Portuguese pack. And whenever we were engaging with people, I had to type, where can we find all the prettiest birds? And then they would have to read off my screen, and then they would have to reply by switching this over here from Portuguese into English. So it was quite cumbersome, but it absolutely worked. The roads were generally very good, except for a few remote areas. And this picture is something I'll talk about right at the end. We had one near disaster with our little car, and I'll come to our car in a second. The weather is perfect in June, July. It's a little bit like our Durban coastline. Beautiful winter days, blue skies, no rain. We had a little bit of rain at the beginning, but that was unusual and a bit unseasonal. The mountainous areas above 1,000 up to 2,000 meters, quite cool. And you can see us over here at Itatiaia wearing jackets. But when we're in Brazil, and this is Sugarloaf Mountain, when we're in Rio, this is Sugarloaf Mountain, we certainly enjoyed swimming in the sea. The food is mostly very nice and plain, wonderful food, not too spicy, and just some wonderful eating places that we went to. Currency is reais or reals. The exchange rate's about 3.50 Rand to a real. And what we found is that most things are similarly priced to what they are in South Africa. I think sort of fuel and car rentals quite a bit cheaper, but some of the restaurants are a little bit more expensive, and accommodation's much of a muchness. So it's similar to doing a road trip in decent parts of South Africa. The Wi-Fi connectivity is tricky on the road. We couldn't get Wi-Fi connectivity. We couldn't get data cards. that's quite complicated. So we had to rely on downloaded maps, and but in most places you get Wi-Fi in the evenings. The books and resources we used, so I bought this book called Birds of Brazil. I did a lot of research up front. It's always better to go to these places after doing sufficient research. I used eBird quite a lot to find out what birds we'd find at different places. And we bought the app as well. And then I used this particular book. It's a birdwatching guide to Southeast Brazil, which gives you site information. And that was enormously helpful just to have a real expectation of what birds to see in different places, because a lot of the birds are very localized, particularly all the endemic species. And then we used local bird guides. So this was a guy, Lucas, at the top. We had him in Ubatuba, and this was a guy by the name of Gerson, and that was at Intervali. So Gerson didn't speak a single word of English, whereas Lucas was quite fluent in broken English, but certainly enough that we could speak English to him and he knew what we were talking about. But most of the time we were conversing with guides using the app, and we had to use the bird app to convert the English names of birds to the Portuguese names of birds, which made it a little bit cumbersome at times. So our transport was the Mighty Doblo. It's a 7-seater, they called it, but it certainly could fit 7 people, but very little people. And we aren't a family of small people. My son is 6'2", my oldest son, Tommy, over here. And most of us are, he's 19, Adam's 17, Jack is 15, and Emma's 11. So it wasn't a spacious car. And we had to take this bag that we strapped to the roof of the car in order to carry 4 of our suitcases. But other than that, the Doblo actually worked very well. We got to most of the places we wanted to get to. We had 1 or 2 minor mishaps, and then we had a relatively major mishap right at the end, which I'll certainly tell you about when we come to the end of the presentation. Okay, so now to go on a day by day and site by site, and I think that's the best way to show you the amazing birds that we saw. There are a lot of bird photos and lots of colorful birds and lots of very special birds. I won't talk about every single one, but certainly where they are special and noteworthy, I will make specific mention. So our first place we went to was Trilha dos Tucanos. We spent 1 night there, and it's a quaint little lodge set in the forests at about 1,500 meters altitude. We arrived there, it was cold and miserable and raining, and all the members of the family, aside from Adam, who was interested in the birds, were dreadfully concerned about the next 2 weeks that lay ahead of them. The bird life at Trilha was absolutely incredible. So Trilha means trail, and Tucanos is obviously toucan. So it's the place of the toucan trails. And this is a no better example of the birds that you see at Trilha than this red-breasted toucan, which is a special of the area. It's not an endemic, but it's a very special bird of that part of Brazil and South America. And they were quite fun to see feeding at the feeders and eating bananas and pawpaw. So that's where Trilha is. It was about a 3-hour drive after we landed. So it was quite an interesting exercise, driving a completely new car on strange roads, using downloaded Google Maps in the rain to places that we'd never been before. So quite daunting getting out of Sao Paulo as well. It's I think it's the 2nd biggest city in the world. It's got 30 million people. So not for the faint-hearted to get in a car and drive to these places. So our first night at Trilha, we arrived, Adam and I walked around the gardens. We took some photographs of birds at the feeders, and Jean and Tommy went for a run and found this quaint little cafe about 5 kilometers from where we were staying. And this little old lady she wasn't that old, but certainly little, and she was a lady, and she was our first real experience with communicating with Brazilians not being able to speak any English. And she wasn't that technically a Fae either, so managing the app with her was very interesting. But we managed to get ourselves some beers, and we enjoyed a nice sort of beer in the overhang of this little quaint shop before dinner. So the next morning, Adam and I woke up bright and early, and we had arranged to meet our guide, Philippe. This is Philippe with the boots and the camo. And we were taken straight to this contraption, which we weren't quite sure what it was until we actually got there. So it was a little sort of canopied structure with bright light. and then this big white sheet. And if you look at the sheet quite closely, you can see hundreds of moths and insects. So overnight, with the bright light, the moths and insects are attracted to the light in this white sheet, and they sit on this white sheet. And the reason they do that is to attract the birds. So it's a very different feeder to what I was used to. So here we had moths instead of bananas and sugar water, and it attracted a different suite of birds. So here are some of the birds. These are wood creepers. This is a white-throated wood creeper and a much, much smaller olivaceous wood creeper. They're part of the funerid or ovenbird family. It's a huge neotropical bird family, the funerids, and wood creepers are a subfamily of those, and they really are amazing birds. You see a lot of them in the neotropics. I think we saw 7 or 8 species of wood creeper, and white-throated is a very large one, nice and easy to photograph, whereas olivaceous, much smaller, probably half the size of a white-throated. And then these were some of the birds that were attracted. So this just gives you a first impression of the colors of the birds that you see in Brazil. Black goggle tanager was incredibly common. Beautiful tanager with wonderful names. Green-headed tanager is probably the most common bird in sort of the feeder areas. Just a spectacular looking bird. This one's looking a bit bedraggled with the rain. This was our first really exciting bird, a brown tanager. Not that common. So our guide Philippe was very excited when he heard one call as it flew over the moth sheet. And we managed to see them come perching and feeding from the moth sheet. They quite enjoyed the insects. And then this rufous-headed tanager also made an appearance, and it's obviously anything with an E is an endemic bird to Brazil, and you'll see a lot of E's on the labeling of the birds that I'm going to show. Buff-fronted foliage gleaner, also another funerid, superficially very similar to brown tanager, and I had to look at my photos more than once to just make sure I was labeling them correctly, but very different birds, but superficially very similar. You can see the shape of the bill is completely different. This is a fruit-eating bird. This is a strictly insect-eating bird. And then tufted ant shrike, this was a remarkably difficult bird to photograph. And then a few more birds at the feeders, just to give an impression. We were completely overwhelmed at Triller just with the number of birds that we saw in such a short space of time, and some of the very special birds. But I won't go through every single one of them. But this golden-winged cacique is a special of the highland Atlantic rainforests. And we saw very few warblers, but these were some of the warblers that we did see. And the warblers in the neotropics are quite different to the warblers we get in Africa. They're far more colorful and generally quite showy. Then we spent some time at the feeders, and they feed the birds at Triller with fruit and sugar water. Not so many hummingbirds there, but these wonderful plain parakeets. These are endemic to Brazil. You wouldn't think they were special because there were literally hundreds of them, but you take the bird seed and you put it in your hand, and they come and they eat right out of your hand, or they sit on top of your head. I know we have some photos of birds sitting on top of Emma's head, and then Jean cuddling up to the very handsome bird guide Philippe. So this is just a video. I hope the sound works on the videos, but this is just to give you a perspective. You can see the tray full of bananas and other fruit. And just before I start the video, these are the red-breasted toucans. This is a maroon-bellied parakeet. This is an olive-green tanager, which is an endemic bird. And this is the real special bird of Triller dos Tucanos. This is almost their title bird. It's called a saffron toucanet. And they are very special for that part of the world. So let's see if the video plays. Thomas had just woken up, so he looked grumpy. Can't have a bird trip or a family trip without Emma whining at one of her brothers, but I wonder if someone can just drop in the chat room whether you heard the sound. If you can just put a quick comment in the chat room as to whether you heard the sound of that video. It'd be useful to know. I'll check that now. All right, so that was a typical site. Okay, sorry, someone's just commented. Yes, you heard the sound, great. Yeah, so that was a typical sort of sitting on the veranda watching the birds, and it really was pretty special to to take photographs. I mean, you can imagine the kind of photography you can get of birds like that. My lens was almost too long. So let me just go to the next slide. So there's our red-breasted toucan in a bit of a jumping phase. And this is a portrait photo of that beautiful saffron toucanet. And then a couple more birds at the feeders, a black-throated grosbeak, which is a special bird of the area, and this red-rump cacique. It's part of the blackbird family, quite common, particularly at feeders. And then this was one of my favorite birds of the trip. It's a tanager. So tanagers are a huge neotropical bird family, and they're kind of similar to our weavers and I guess our bishops. They're fruit eaters and insect eaters. There are a huge range of colors and shapes and sizes, but this magpie tanager is certainly one of the most bizarre shaped tanager. It doesn't look like a tanager at all, hence its name, but really characteristic, and this beautiful yellow eye and those amazing colors. And this is a little bit of a crest on the neck, which is quite amazing. Quite a big tanager, certainly much bigger than many of the others. And then the parakeets, here's our plain parakeet, which is endemic, and then a nice portrait of the maroon belly parakeet. And then woodpeckers are an absolute favorite of mine. This yellow-fronted woodpecker is about the size of cardinal, our cardinal woodpecker, but just the most beautiful colors. And then probably in my favorite birds of the trip, I didn't list it in my top 10, but I'm not sure why. This is a blonde-crested woodpecker. It's not that special in terms of endemism. It's quite widespread in the southern part of Brazil, and it goes into Argentina. But it's an absolutely spectacular bird, and it's got that shaggy blonde crest. And we actually had great views of it. It's an enormous woodpecker, relatively speaking. So it's about double the size of the yellow-fronted woodpecker. So even quite substantially bigger than our bearded woodpecker here in South Africa. And then these were two of the very special birds we saw. Black-fronted piping guan. It's not a great photo. It was feeding on these palm fruits. It was a bird that we had very, very much hoped to see. And then we saw it just outside the room we were staying in on our very first morning. So kind of destroyed all the impressions that we had that it was going to be a tough bird to see. But weirdly enough, well, not weirdly at all, we only saw it once on that first morning. And I'm very grateful that we did, because it would have been disappointing to miss it. And then spot-billed toucanet is quite a special bird of the area. This is the female. We unfortunately didn't see the male, which is a slightly bolder colored bird, but you can see where it gets its name with those marks on the bill. And then tinamoos are another neotropical bird family, very shy. They hard to find. They generally are, nocturnal to a large extent, or certainly crepuscular. And the only way you have a chance of seeing them is if they are relatively habituated. So at Trilla dostricans, they have sort of seed feeders, and this solitary tinamoo came out in the evening, and then we saw it again in the morning, and it was nice to get a decent photograph of it. Okay, so then we moved after Trilla, and the family was starting to get concerned that we'd never see the sun. And then we moved on to Intervale State Park. So if you look on the map, we were at Trilla, and then we drove sort of 2.5 hours to the south west to Paraíso Eco Lodge. We were given instructions by WhatsApp from the manager at Paraíso, and he sent us this document, which is, as you can see, all in Portuguese, which helped us very little with all these little pictures and arrows. And essentially this circle bit said, whatever you do, don't use Waze or GPS or Google Maps, because it takes you on completely the wrong roads. So you have to follow these little pictures. So I had Jack Google translating all the wording of this document as we were driving, to make sure that we ended up in the right place. And I'd made an arrangement with the manager that we would arrive at the gate, and the gate would be left open for us at about 5 o'clock in the evening. And we arrived there at exactly 5 o'clock, and the gate was locked. So I put on my running shoes. It was about 3.5 km to get to the lodge, and I ran to the lodge to find some help and get someone to come and open the gate for us, which they eventually did, and we managed to get in. But it was a relatively uncertain start to our time at Paraíso. So Paraíso was quite a strange place. It had lots of accommodation, but we were the only people there. They had quite a few non-birding activities. We went to a lovely waterfall. We went caving, And then we enjoyed sundowners just at the lakes in front of the lodge. But we did go birding with our guide, Bendito. Here's Bendito over here. And Bendito was a very interesting man. He was as useless a bird guide as I've ever come across. He couldn't speak any English. And even though we told him on the Translate app that we couldn't speak Portuguese, he kept on telling us a whole bunch of things in Portuguese. And it was a very difficult 2.5 hours of birding before breakfast. This was a bird that perched very nicely for us, but he had no idea what it was. So I had to take a photograph and then check its identification afterwards. And hermits are a type of hummingbird, and they are quite common and regular. So the fact that he didn't know what a scale-throated hermit was quite concerning. We did have one moment of birding contribution that he made. We heard a bird calling, and he got quite excited, and then he gave the name, which was Korokachau, and it's an onomatopoeic name of this bird called the hooded berry eater. And it was a bird that I'd earmarked as a bird that I really had to see while we were in Brazil. It's endemic to the Atlantic rainforests, and when he heard it call and we managed to figure it out using the Portuguese names on the bird app, we found out it was a hooded berry eater, and we were pretty excited to now try and use a little bit of playback to call it in so we could get a sighting. You can see I've used a photograph from eBird, and that means that we never saw a hooded berry eater, despite hearing it call constantly for about 3 or 4 days while we had intervales. So it was a bit disappointing, but it's one of those things. You have to miss something so that you've got a reason to go back. Here were some of the birds. You can see how many endemics we saw. This squamata antbird was also a real target. They turned out to be quite common, but very tricky to get a photograph. Grey-hooded attila, it's part of the tyrant flycatchers. Very, very pretty. It looks a bit like our Cape rock thrush, but completely different looking bird with that very long bill. Grey-headed toady flycatcher. Here's a streaked xenops, which is a type of funarid, and then a long-tailed tyrant, one of the easier to identify and more attractive tyrant flycatchers. This is a bird called a sharple. It's also quite closely related to the tyrants, and it was a bird, again, that we were really desperate to see. And after just one day of being in Brazil, we got a very good sighting of it. I got a reasonably decent photograph. We thought, well, we'll see lots of sharples, and it turned out that this was the only sharple that we saw on the entire trip. So that was a relief that I actually managed to get a photograph. And then some more woodpeckers, ochre-collared piculette. Piculettes are just the most amazing little woodpeckers. They're tiny. They're about the size of a white-eye, maybe even smaller. And they're very cool to see. They're not that hard to get onto. They sort of behave like woodpeckers, and they spend their time working through the moss and tapping on little nooks and crannies on the branches. So very nice to see ochre-collared. We saw one other piculette species. I'll have a photo of that shortly. And then this white-browed woodpecker, which I think is definitely one of the more attractive woodpeckers. So all of these birds we were identifying by ourselves. We got very little help from Bendito. Here's white-spotted woodpecker, and then this is just a fantastic woodpecker, very special bird of the area, robust woodpecker. So if you can imagine a woodpecker the size of a crow, maybe a house crow, it's about that size. They are just amazing birds. So quite closely related to the extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. And if you know pileated woodpecker, same genus as that. And just a very beautiful bird. This is the male, and that's the female with that lovely creamy sort of stripe, moustachial stripe. And when these birds drum on the trees, it is the most amazing sound. It sounds, if you know bearded woodpeckers drumming, it's loud, but these types of woodpeckers are even louder than that. It's just a fantastic sound when you hear it in the forest. And then after spending one day at Paraíso, we went next door to the Intervale State Park, and we hired Sherson, who was an outstanding bird guide, and he took us into Intervale State Park forest, which is a very protected area. It's an absolutely massive forest, but very few accessible roads. This road we were on is called the Carmo Road, which is world famous in birding circles. You can walk it for probably 25 kilometers. And I think a lot of people do that if they've got lots of time. We didn't have that much time. We had just one day at Intervales, but we probably walked only about 5 Ks of the road and had some amazing endemics. Not so many in terms of species count, but just a lot of endemic birds. So here's an example of how difficult the photography is. We saw these 2 birds. If you remember that photo of Adam photographing birds in that beautiful sunlit corner of the forest. He was photographing these two tyrannuletes. So Usterlet tyrannulet and Sao Paulo tyrannulet. Sao Paulo tyrannulet, they're both endemic, as you can see with the e-donation. They are, Sao Paulo tyrannulet is absolutely tiny. They're superficially very similar birds, but Sao Paulo is quite a lot smaller. Just impossible to get a decent photograph of these birds. It's a bit like our Livingston's flycatcher. They move very fast, always in the gloom and hard to get onto. Then pin-tailed manakin, it's a wonderful endemic manakin species, very weirdly colored for a manakin. And then this was one of the highlights of the day. And in fact, we voted it as our bird of the day. Very, very hard bird to see, cinnamon vented piha. It's a type of tyrant as well. And just battled a lot to see it. We were standing watching it, or listening to it call, and I happened to turn away just as it flew over our heads, and Adam got a view of it. And I was quite devastated because I thought that was the only chance we would have. And then it actually came back and sat and started feeding on these fruits. So we managed to get a photo of some description. And then some of the antrens. The antrens are tiny little birds, and here are two endemic antrens. So those 6 birds are all endemic. Certainly not the only endemics that we saw that day, but just it shows how specialized those Atlantic rainforests are. And then everybody loves a trogon, black-throated trogon, certainly very widespread birds, but always nice to see the male on the left and the female on the right. And then we went into slightly more open habitat. Jason took us to a little wetland here. And if you can see just along the reed beds over here, there's a little bit of a gap. He took us there and he threw a little bit of crumbs, basically breadcrumbs, in between a gap in the reeds. And the next thing we had this red and white crake, which is a particularly special bird of the area, coming and eating the breadcrumbs. And it's always a bit tricky to have these breadcrumbs in a photo, but you can see that we certainly had some help. And the same thing with the blackish rail, but these birds are habituated, they're very special. And so the bird guides have managed to find a way that gives them the best chance of showing their clients the birds they want to see. So this was probably one of the highlights of our trip, is trying to find a bird called a spot-winged wood quail. We had missed them earlier when the rest of the family went on just a general hike, and they had a sighting of a small flock of the spot-winged wood quail. And Jason took us to this log where they put seed out, and we sat for 45 minutes in the morning and they didn't come. And then we went back there in the afternoon and we were sitting, we were there for about 10 minutes. And I eventually said to Jason, I think we should move on and do something else because it clearly is not going to happen. And the next thing we heard some scuffling behind us, and about 12 of these spot-winged wood quails just ran past us and started feeding on the seed on this log. So that's what it looks like. It is a incredibly attractive bird, a little bit comical in some ways as they bounced around and fed. And you can see I've got a short video which I'll play, and you can see them feeding on the seed and right in front of us. So let's get the. So that was a real highlight. And then a couple of photos of the family going on a hike. They went up to this wonderful viewpoint, and you can just see the extent of the Intervale State Park. It's really one of the main strongholds of this Atlantic rainforest that remains. And then it was on to our next site after 2 nights at, well, it was actually 3 nights at Paraíso. And then we moved on to Fazenda Bacuri and the Tanquas River. So if you remember, we headed inland to the area called the Mini Pantanal. Very different habitat, sort of lower altitude, much warmer. We had much more farming habitat. This particular farm, Fazenda Bacuri, there is an indigenous forest very nearby, which we didn't even visit because we just didn't have time, because we focused on the wetland. But it's mostly sort of cattle farming, and they are planting eucalypt wherever the eye can see, which is pretty depressing, but at least it serves as accommodation and access to the Tanquas River. So that's kind of the habitat. It's a typical farmyard. Here's Tommy and Emma at a nice time of day, and you can see the sun is finally shining for the rest of the family. So we were self-catering when we were at the Tanquas River at Fazenda Bacuri. Jean and I very domesticated in the kitchen, making spaghetti bolognese, and Jean even more domesticated. So the toilets in South America very widely, and I'd been to Peru before, so I knew the drill. You don't actually flush toilet paper down the toilet, you put it in a bin. So wherever you have a toilet, you put toilet paper in the bin, and it's quite disconcerting if you're not used to it, because when you open the bin, everybody else's toilet paper is sitting in there. And my family battled to make the adjustment to understanding that if you put toilet paper in the toilet, it's going to get blocked. So we had quite a few times where we had to use the plunger to clear the toilet. We actually had to leave Fazenda very early the one morning. Well, the morning we left, because we needed to get to somewhere where there was a toilet, because the toilet was completely blocked. Aside from toilet troubles, the birding was amazing. This is a fantastic bird. It's basically the South American equivalent of our secretary bird. Obviously, a very, very large terrestrial bird. It's called a red-legged Seriema, and they kind of have similar habits to secretary birds. They're not raptors per se, but they do feed on other birds and reptiles. And this pair was actually two birds out of 4 that were almost like part of the security detail at Fazenda Bukuri, because they just paraded around on the lawn. It was a bird that we had hoped we'd see, and we actually did see one in an open field on one of our commutes. But it was really nice to see them up and close and get some really nice photos. This wonderful powder blue makeup, and this beautiful red bill, and this crest on the top of the bill. And they do have this habit of sitting on top of these poles, and they've got the most unpleasant call. So when you hear them calling, it's quite startling. It's a little bit like a peafowl, I guess, the call of a peafowl. The birds at Fazenda in the actual farmyard, this crested Oripendula. It's Oripendula because it's got a golden tail. So Oro is gold, and Pendula means obviously the hanging tail. So it's a subfamily of birds in South America. He has a masked gnat eater. And then this is the quintessential subtropical bird. It's a toko toucan, very large toucan with just an enormous bill. I nearly missed seeing a toko toucan. I went for a run with Jeannie when we arrived, and I made the error of leaving Adam back at the farmhouse to do some birding. And I came back and he had seen a toko toucan and photographed one in flight. And I was absolutely devastated and hoped that I hadn't missed my chance. Didn't quite get the same photo he got, but at least I did see a toko toucan. And this was just a very good example of how useless one can be if you don't have a guide. We saw this hummingbird feeding on these little thorns, managed to get a decent photograph of it, and we were absolutely perplexed as to what it was, but we assumed it was just something quite ordinary. I sent it to one of the guides that guided for us, and it turned out to be a striped-breasted starthroat, which is a very special endemic. So at least we didn't miss that one. So we went to the Tankwas River. We went in these little boats. We had 2 boats, obviously for all the members of the family, and you travel through these vegetated areas. It's a bit like going to the Mabamba swamp in Uganda. Get stuck every now and again, and the drivers have to pull you through the vegetation. But this was the route that we took. So we traveled all through these little nooks and crannies, and saw just an amazing selection of birds. So I'm going to go quite quickly through the birds we saw. Amazon kingfisher, this is a monotypic bird family, a black-capped Dolichobius. Then this wonderful long-winged harrier, plumbeous rail, Savannah hawk, and then wattle jacana, white-headed marsh tyrant, white-rumped monchita, yellow-headed caracara, lacunda nighthawk, and yellow-chinned spinetail, rosy-billed pochard, white-winged coot, and guira cuckoo. These guira cuckoos are great birds. They sort of congregate in groups of like 6 to 8 birds, and they're very clumsy and they're very showy. They're very unusual cuckoos, so very different to the cuckoos that we are used to seeing here, where they are hard to see, and when you see them, they seem to dash through the forest. These birds tend to sit on tops of trees and make themselves very available to be photographed. And then another picture of the long-winged terrier. So on that particular day at the Tankwas River, it was the highest list count we had for a day. We saw 100 species in the day. I think I probably had 35 lifers, and Adam probably had 70. We went with a guide, Gustavo, and you can see his car was appropriately decorated. He has a Toco toucan, and here are some Chilean flamingos. This is a bare-throated bellbird, and this is one of the doves. I think it's a purple-spotted wood dove. Or ground dove. Just an incredible day. We stood in this little arbitrary forest patch. It's not even a forest patch, it's a little bit of woodland behind a toilet in this little village. And we just saw lifer after lifer in this wonderful little spot. So here are some of the birds we saw. This narrow-billed wood creeper, another funerid. There's another funerid over here, this spine-tail, great anshrike. These euphonias are always very pretty. And then a beautiful glittering bellied emerald hummingbird. And then some more woodpeckers, little woodpecker and a white-barred piculette. Here's another piculette, really, really tiny birds. And then a whole bunch of tanagers. So Yaka tanager, burnished buff, and silver-beaked tanager, just showing you the incredible diversity of the tanagers, just the amazing colors. And there are lots more tanagers to come in this presentation. And then this incredible plush-crested jay with this beautiful electric blue eye stripe and the yellow eye. We saw just one plush-crested jay on our entire trip, and it was just a spectacular bird. Curl-crested jays were slightly more common, but no less handsome. We saw them in groups of about 6 or 7 birds, and really nice to photograph. So we also ended up eating at a wonderful little restaurant in a town called Nhembi. When Adam and I were birding with Gustavo, Jean did a recce with the other kids and found a restaurant run by this lady and her father, and they put together an amazing meal. It was a Sunday, and they weren't actually officially open. But they opened for us, and they served us, just our family, an amazing meal with rump steak and chicken strips with all these beautiful vegetables and fruits and seeds. So a real highlight. When we were having sundowners over here, it was getting a little bit dark and gloomy, and the bats were flying over the river, and an aplomado falcon came and caught a bat right in front of us and perched in this tree at the back here. And Adam was able to get a photograph. I have photographed aplomado falcon before, so I didn't bother, but he at least got a live photograph of a really special bird. So after the Tankwas River, we headed to Itachiai National Park. It was quite an interesting exercise. We couldn't quite figure out the pronunciation of Itachiai. I'd been told it was Itagia, and every time I told someone that we were going to Itagia, they didn't know what I was talking about. So it turned out that it's actually Itachiai. And we stayed at this wonderful hotel called Hotel da Ipe. This is the Serra de Mar forest in Itachiai National Park. And you can see it was quite a long drive. We had to go through some very sort of urbanized areas. This Campinas, it was like 6-lane highways in both directions, just cars and people and concrete everywhere. It really was. This whole section here joins Campinas and Sao Paulo. It's not the most attractive part of the trip, but we then traveled and got to just the most wonderful place at Hotel de Ipe. So this is the hotel. This is the view from our room. Certainly was pretty cold, but beautiful evenings, these wonderful trees, and there were feeders down by the restaurant. This is Emma standing on the balcony at the restaurant, and we saw some very special hummingbirds. So this white-throated hummingbird and the black-eared fairy, they were 2 new hummingbirds for our list, and they were it was the only time we saw them was that evening at Hotel de Ipe. So it just shows the value of going to different places where birds are just different in different places. So here's another little video. This is a Brazilian ruby. This is the hotel veranda in front of the restaurant. This bird at the back here is a dusky-legged guan, and I've got some photos of that coming up now, but you'll just see how nice it is to be close to these hummingbirds. It's a female Brazilian ruby, which is an endemic. So even Emma was enamored with the hummingbird feeders, and it really is a special experience. If you've never been to the tropics, it's just something that takes your breath away when you go to these feeders and see these amazing birds. So here's a male Brazilian ruby, and I've put these 3 photographs together for a specific reason, just to show you the impact of iridescence on these birds. So this is the male Brazilian ruby, and it's obviously facing slightly to the side. And then when it turns a little bit, you start to get a hint of the iridescence on the throat. And then when it's facing directly, you get this incredible purple or sheen, and then obviously the green crown. So same bird, just showing different angles, but very pretty. Difficult to photograph Brazilian ruby. You always want it with its head to the side like this, but then you don't get this beautiful sheen of the iridescence. So here's the dusky leg guan, and they're quite difficult birds to see in most parts of Brazil, but at Hotel de Ipe, they've been sort of putting stuff out for them to come and feed. Sounds like everything's canned in Brazil, but it really isn't. There's plenty of birds that are very hard to find. So the few freebies are very well appreciated. So these dusky leg guans, they're noisy and they're big, and they flap and they land, and they almost knock you over as they fly past you. But it's great to see such special birds nice and close, and they really are quite attractive when you get decent photographs. These plumages are amazing. So this was a hotel just down the road from where we were staying. It's now been mothballed, and the good thing about these mothballed hotels is that you get all this overgrown vegetation in the gardens of the hotel, and it makes for great birding. So this little garden patch here on a walk that we did in the afternoon, we just saw some wonderful birds, and this probably being the most special, which is this orange-eyed thornbird. And this particular walk we did in the afternoon was just the two of us without a guide. And birds that we found, especially the endemic ones, the ones that we found ourselves, were always quite a bit more rewarding than the ones that were pointed out to us by the guides. So this orange-eyed thornbird, it's also a funerid. So it just shows the diversity of that bird family. And there's a wonderful artist. He's a bit of a nutcase, very strange man, but he paints the most beautiful bird paintings. This was a mural just outside the restaurant at Hotel de Ipe. And we actually saw almost every bird on this mural. We missed this swallowtail katinga, which was my most wanted bird for the trip. But we were out of season and just a very, very hard bird to find. And then we also missed the spare-throated bellbird, which was probably my second most wanted bird. So you'd think that we had an unsuccessful trip, but I certainly wouldn't describe it as that. So we saw most of these birds, and it's always nice to look back at these photos and well, this particular mural, and see how many of the birds we did see. Here's the robust woodpecker. There's the yellow-fronted woodpecker. There's the magpie tanager, golden-winged cacique, burnished buff tanager, pin-tailed manikin, and so on. So the very special trip that you do when you're at Hotel do Ipe is to go to a place called the Agulhas Negras Road, and it's the road of the Black Needles. So Agulhas Negras is Black Needles, and we had to drive down to the main road and then up into a separate valley, up this long winding road through the forest, and then onto the Agulhas Negras Road, which you can see is enlarged over here. And what you do is you drive through this high altitude forest at about 2,000 meters, and then you come out at this araucaria. So araucaria is a type of tree. There's actually a tit spine tail, which is endemic to araucaria trees, which we sadly failed to find. But then you pop out into this more alpine sort of habitat where there are just a totally different suite of birds, and we were looking for one particular bird there, and I'll come to that in a sec. But just a very nice way to spend a day, and for that you need a guide, and we hired a guide by the name of Sylvander, who actually drove 3 hours from where he lived to come and guide us, and he was amazing. He just wanted to spend the entire day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. He was going to probably get into the Doblo with us and spend the rest of the journey with us. Very, very nice man, and just an amazing bird guide. Not one single word of English though. So this is the view from the winding forest road, and you can see just the weather was just spectacular. And this is the lower section of the forest, and then this is coming out into the more alpine sort of habitat where there are these rocky domes. This is the top of the mountain, and just looking for the special birds there. This is back in the forest, and we were doing some sort of park the car and slow walk through the forest and listen for the special birds, and here are some of them. So just a huge concentration of endemics. This green-crowned plovercrest we saw once, and so fortunate that it was perched nice and quietly, and I could get a decent photograph, so it's an endemic. And then we had these two warbling finches, and we saw this buff-throated warbling finch on our first day as we arrived at Hotel de Ipe, and I completely messed up the identification. I thought it was a bay-chested warbling finch, which was the one we expected to see. I was embarrassingly corrected by a friend who picked up that it was the incorrect identification when I sent some pictures on WhatsApp. But fortunately, the next day we saw bare-chested warbling finch as well. So those were two endemic birds. And then just the tanagers. And this particular slide is just a huge illustration of these phenomenal colors of these tanagers. So this bird, the diadeemed tanager, we rated as one of the best birds of the trip. This diadeemed, it means crowned. Diadem is a crown. And there are, I think, 4 bird species worldwide that have got the words diadeemed. It's the sandpiper plover. There's a parrot called diadeemed parrot, and then there's a diadeemed tapaculo. I've seen now 3 out of the 4. I've seen the sandpiper plover, the tapaculo, and this tanager. And this was just a very special bird. Very large tanager, but this royal blue color of the bird is something to behold, particularly when it flies and you see it in the sunlight. It's just incredible. And then these two endemic. So diadeemed tanager is not an endemic. These were the very special endemic tanagers. So this is brassy breasted. Quite a common bird. We saw quite a few of them. So you can see the brassy breast. Superficially, they look very similar, these two. But this gilt-edged tanager was quite a lot harder to find. We only saw 1 flock of them, and we had to be very concentrated to get some decent photographs. But just the colors on these tanagers are just incredible. And I think they deserved a full page photo. This is brassy breasted tanager, and just this electric blue around the eye, and this amazing sort of verdant green in the breast feathers. It's just a incredible looking bird. And you don't see these tanagers at feeders, and they're generally restricted to sort of the dark forest. So when you find them, you've got to be quick to get a decent photo. Okay, so these are 2 birds we didn't see on our trip, but I wanted to use them as an illustration for this particular story. So these are cotingas. So cotinga is quite a large family of neotropical birds. They are incredibly diverse in terms of their appearance, their call, their behavior. And this is to illustrate how different cotingas can look. So the one on the left is an Andean cock of the rock, which I've seen in Peru. And then the one on the right is a blue cotinga. Just giving you some sense of how variable they are. So we were looking for one particular cotinga. It was a bird I'd read about. It was a very low probability you'd see it, and you can see the eBird distribution map. So completely restricted to basically the Serra de Mar mountain range. If you look over here, this is where Itatiaia National Park is. And as you can see, it's a very dark purple spot. So if we were going to see a black and gold cotinga, it was going to be at Itatiaia National Park. The nice thing about black and gold cotinga is that it has a fairly distinctive call. So this was the habitat that we were looking for it. They feed in the tops of these trees, and they're quite territorial. So you'll have 1 or 2 birds. You'll have 1 bird, and then you might have another bird many, many kilometers away, and you hear them call. And I hope this call plays, but if you listen to the call, it's the most haunting, amazing sound. So let me just play it. I hope you can hear this. So just because it's so cool, I'm going to play it again. So we heard that call quite early on in our day on the Galles Negros Road, and we got very excited, and we spent about an hour looking in the trees. Our guide, Sylvander, this is Sylvander over here, he said to us that they'll fly across the road, and you've got to watch where they go, and then you look for them in the canopy. They move quietly through the canopy. It's quite a large bird, and we just got to look out for it very carefully. There was one moment where it flew across the road. I saw the shape of the bird moving across the road, and I said to Adam, I think I've just seen it, but definitely not well enough to tick. Certainly not well enough to enjoy it. And obviously he hadn't seen it, so that didn't help. And then we went along the road, and we spent another hour and a half looking for a whole bunch of other birds. And then we heard one calling very close by, literally in the tree just above us. And finally managed to get a sighting of it. This is a terrible photo, but you can see it's got this sort of orangey beak. It's mostly black, and it's got this bright yellow shoulder. And that view would have been good enough for me. I was super excited to see it. It's kind of looks a little bit like a cuckoo shrike, like our black cuckoo shrike, but quite a bit bigger. And then it popped out into the open and gave us an incredible view for about 3 seconds. And then and ironically, this photo, I don't quite know how I managed to do this, but this photo does not show any of the yellow on the shoulder, but it still has the eye nice and sharp and that beautiful orange bill. So it sat there for about 3 seconds and then it flew away, and that was the last we ever saw of a black and gold Katinga. And we decided, no matter what we saw from then on, it was going to be very difficult to beat that bird for bird of the trip. So then it was on to some more endemic birds, and there were plenty of them, antbirds and terannulates, this velvety black tyrant, which was nice and showy. And then we went to the alpine area. We missed the Araucaria tit spinetail, and we were looking for a bird that occurs in this habitat, very scrubby stuff. And you can see that's its eBird distribution, so even more range restricted than black and gold Katinga, but certainly apparently a lot easier to find. That's where Itachiai National Park is. So once again, we were in the right place, and we managed to see an Itachiai spinetail. It's always nice to find a bird that's named after the place that you're birding in. So it is the only bird that has Itachiai in its name. So it was a pretty special thing. But as you can see, this is definitely only one for the connoisseurs. It is a completely brown bird, but very, very nice to see. So then at the end of the day, Sylvander brought us back to our hotel, and I thought we'd say goodbye to him at about 4 o'clock. And he said, no, we've got to do some owling. And if you know me as a birder, you'll know that owling is literally my least favorite type of birding. You mustn't get me wrong, I absolutely love owls, but the process of finding them at the end of a very long day of birding is, for me, not a great way to finish a day. You generally don't see any owls, you spend 2 hours in the dark playing different calls and generally turning up nothing. So we were standing in the forest here, and I said to Adam, I'm going to just write my daily blog while we stand in the forest in the dark, because we're definitely not going to see an owl. And I said, I'm so certain we won't see an owl that if we do see one, I'll have a tequila. So not 5 minutes after we started looking, we got this amazing tawny-browed owl that flew into the tree and perched for us, got our amazing photo, and I was super relieved because we could say to Sylvander that our day was now at an end. I wasn't going to be looking for any more owls after seeing this. And then you can see I kept to my promise, and I had a tequila at the restaurant. All right, so we did this amazing hike. The non-birders took over on the one day. Jeannie said we have to do a hike to the top of this mountain, which turned out to be 16 kilometers up to the top of this peak and back down again. You can see just beautiful habitat. It was very, very frustrating walking through this forest with lots of birdsong all around us, but not really knowing what we were hearing and not really being able to stop and look for the birds. I did stop and look. Jeannie wasn't too fussed about us stopping, but the birds in the forest are so hard to find if you don't know what you're looking for. So this was at the top of the mountain. It was at 1,700 meters and definitely deserved our dinner that night. So the non-birders got super excited at the end of Itachiai, and off we headed to Rio. This photo is taken from Christ the Redeemer, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but just a wonderful, wonderful city. It's quite daunting driving into Rio. Our Doblo was managing the roads, but the traffic is hellish, and lots of motorbikes buzzing in between the cars, so quite hair-raising. So this is our routes down to Rio. And then just to orientate for those that haven't been to Rio, that's where we stayed at a very nice suburb called Leblon. There is Christ the Redeemer. That's Copacabana Beach, which is probably one of the most famous beaches on the planet. Ipanema is almost as famous. That's Sugarloaf Mountain, which is where the cable car is. There's the Botanical Gardens, which was always going to be a place we'd go and look for some birds. And then this is Tijuca National Park, which we also spent some time doing some birding. So this was our arrival. We arrived at 12 o'clock, put our bags down, jumped into an Uber and drove off to the base of the hike to Christ the Redeemer. Most people get in a shuttle or a bus or a tram and they go to the top of the mountain, but we decided to hike, and it's probably about the equivalent of hiking from, I would say, Deer Park to the top of Table Mountain. It's a 710-meter elevation, and it was a very, very difficult hike, but certainly worth it. We got to the top, and Jeannie and Tommy enjoyed a gin and tonic at the top of the mountain, and the views are absolutely spectacular. So this is looking sort of east. This is the suburb of Leblon. Here's that beautiful lake. I forget its name. Ipanema Beach runs over here, and Copacabana Beach is over there, and the botanical gardens are down over here, and Tajuca National Park is on these slopes. We then came down after enjoying the top of the mountain. We had a schedule, we had to stick to it. So swim in the Atlantic Ocean was on the cards, and Jeannie managed to attract a caipirinha salesperson. Caipirinha is a very typical drink of Brazil. It's a cocktail with alcohol called cachaça. And this guy put this tray in front of Jean and said, here's a caipirinha. So she grabbed it off the tray, and he then smoothed the sand because he could tell we were tourists, and he wanted to write the number down, and he wrote 100 reais for a caipirinha. So that's a 350 Rand price for a cocktail. So I laughed at him and I told him to take it away, and I don't want to see him. So he smoothed the sand and he wrote 50. I said, that's still too much. He smoothed the sand again and wrote 30. I said, that's still too much. And eventually Jean just blurted out, we'll pay you 20. And he said, done. And so she enjoyed a caipirinha. And then we realized half an hour later that we'd been swindled, because most other caipirinhas were being sold at 10 reais, that it was definitely worth it. So Rio was just a place where we did very little birding, but we just enjoyed the city. We rented bicycles for an entire day, and we cycled around the entire city, from where our bike shop was, along Ipanema, Copacabana, and then to the cable car station at Sugarloaf Mountain, which was quite amazing. This is the cable car, and this is the view from Sugarloaf Mountain. Here's Copacabana Beach, Christ the Redeemer is to the right here, and there's Ipanema here. And you can see these mountains, and when you travel in the city, you've got to go under all these tunnels that goes from one bowl into the next. And you can see this is a beautiful beach called Red Beach, which we spent some time at, and look at all the black vultures. So there are a few birds up there. So some more refreshments. I was having a beer, and Emma was drinking some coconut water. And this is a photo of the kids at Sugarloaf Mountain on Red Beach. And then we had an amazing eating experience at a churrascaria restaurant. Churrascaria is just a style of eating where it's an eat as much as you like sort of carvery, and they bring different cuts of meat to your table, and then they slice it onto your plate, and you have these little tweezers which you use to pull the meat off the slicing, and then you have rumps and fillets and sirloin and fish and chicken and pork and a whole bunch of different types of amazing meat, and cooked so beautifully. And it was definitely the best meal we had in Brazil, and I can almost say probably the best meal I've ever had in my life. It was just amazing. And then this was a typical night scene on Ipanema Beach, the restaurant strip next to the beach. And then we did do a little bit of birding here at the Botanical Gardens. It was a little bit more disappointing than I'd expected. We thought we'd see a lot more birds. We did get another guan, it's rusty margin guan, and a spot-breasted antverio. And then we went up to the Tajuca National Park. And once again, we were flying solo. So Adam and I were delighted to find this tiny little antbird, which is called a scaled antbird, and it's endemic. This is the male on the left and the female on the right. Just some more arbitrary birds. Great Kiskadee was probably the most common bird of the entire trip. We heard, it's a call that you learn very quickly because they are so obvious, a bit like a fork-tailed drongo in terms of its call, very noticeable and loud. And then another white-bird piculate in the gardens. So after Rio, our 2-day whirlwind trip around Rio, where we, I think, fitted in probably 5 days of tourism stuff, we went to this island called Ilha Grande. Ilha Grande is the way they say it. Here's Emma sitting in the heart, and it's situated about 150 kilometers west of Rio. This is the island over here, and here's just a slightly better view of it. There's where the island is. This is kind of the view from the town. This is the main streets of the town, and this is where Abrao is. This is where the main town is. This Conceito de Jacaré is where you get the ferry, and you get a ferry. There are no cars on the island. You can't get a car there, so you park your car in a little secure parking lot, and you get a ferry across. So this is one of the real adventurous stories that we had. We arrived in Conceição de Jacaré, which is this little town, and we thought that the ferry was a very formal arrangement where you sort of go to a ferry terminal and you pay your money, which is a set price, and you get the ferry across, and then you have a return trip. And what we didn't realize is that it was basically a free-for-all. Lots of operators, and as you drive into the town, they can see you coming to the island, and they try and sell you their best priced ferry trip. So we started our negotiations at about 200 reais per person for the return trip. That's 750 rand per person, and I thought that was too expensive. So Tommy went in one direction, I went in another direction, and we tried to find a cheaper option. And we eventually settled on a guy who looked pretty dodgy, but he seemed okay. And he had this interesting hairstyle. It was mostly dark with these little white sort of squares on his head. And so he quickly became known as Chessboard. So Chessboard offered us a return trip per person of 130 rand, which is probably 500 rand per person or something of that effect. And I thought, okay, that's as good as we're going to get based on what we'd heard. So we struck a deal with him, and he said he'll meet us on the beach, and off we go. So we all gathered waiting for him, and we could see the boat out into the bay that he was getting his driver to come fetch us. And instead of it going left to where the ferry terminal was, where there was this long pier in the background, the boat went to the right, so to sort of like a public beach. So he called us, and we lifted our bags, and off we go, and we drag it through the sand. So that's the route that we took. And then we get onto the beach, and here's our boat, and here's Chessboard over here. You can see his lovely hairstyle. And he starts shouting at us. He's saying, let's go, let's go, let's go. And quite animated, quite sort of vigorous. And I'm thinking, I was just taking my phone out to take a nice like happy snap as we're about to get onto the boat. And then I noticed this lady over here, and she's got a very official looking badge. And I looked to my right, and she's got a colleague who is now cell phone videoing this whole episode. And he's shouting at us to get in the boat. She's shouting at us, whatever she was shouting at us, I don't even know. So I'm throwing the bags on, and I'm thinking, are we getting into the boat? Is this a pirate? What's going on? Don't know what she was saying. And I mean, there are people swimming in the sea. They seem to be totally oblivious to what was going on. So he was trying to push it out the boat, and she was holding onto the boat and trying to keep it in. And it got quite nervy at a moment. And as we got pushed out, the whole thing being filmed by this guy, I thought we were going to get arrested. Our mate Chessboard was shouting at her. And the next thing, he turned with his back to her, bent over and dropped his pants and showed his bum to this poor lady. Well, I say poor lady, she was equally as unpleasant as he was. So at that moment, it was a bit shocking to Emma. She burst into tears. And then I really thought, I didn't know what to think. But it was quite a nerve-wracking moment, because I thought, well, what if they are pirates? What if we get around this island over here and there's a boat waiting to take all our stuff away from us? In the end, it all worked out okay. We on the boat here, you can see we're looking a bit more relaxed. This was actually on the way back. You can see we actually asked him to take us back. You can see why we called him Chessboard, but he seemed very happy with life. What we think transpired is that he's obviously an unofficial operator, and they were trying to stop him from operating in opposition to sort of the official operators from whom they earn a fee. So that was our sort of our introduction to Ilha Grande. So here's Ilha Grande. This is the town. We stayed where that little blue pin is. And this beach over here called Lopes Mendes is one of the most famous beaches in Brazil. And the only way to get there is either by boat to go all the way around, or is to hike through the forest, which is what we did. We hiked along all these forest sections to this Praia de Palmas. Praia means beach, and then to Praia de Puso, and then across this ridge and onto the beach of Lopes Mendes, which is certainly as beautiful as it looked. Wonderful surfing waves, and the kids hired a surfboard and had a bit of a surf. And then we took the ferry back and had a far more enjoyable ferry trip back, which was much better than our trip with Chessboard. A couple of birds, some seabirds, brown boobies were very common, and as were magnificent frigate birds. And then we even got the family to stop for a photo of a blue mannequin, which was quite nice. And then we saw two of our highlight birds of the trip. We went out early one morning before breakfast into this little forest next to the town, and we saw this bird called the black-cheeked gnat-eater, which is an endemic. It's related to the antbirds, not the antbirds, the antpitters, very closely related to the antpitters. And it was very rewarding to find this bird. I actually recognized the call. I'd been learning a few of the calls and I heard it calling in the forest. And I said to Adam, I think that's a black-cheeked gnat-eater. And so we played a little bit of playback and this thing popped out and gave us an amazing view. And here was another incredibly special bird. So it's a red ruff fruit crow and it's another Katinga. So you can see completely different to black and gold Katinga, but same family of birds. And just the Katingas are just such special birds. They seem to have such a gentle nature, and the sky sat very quietly, just not too worried. They're difficult to photograph because they're always sitting in the canopy, but we got very good views of this amazingly special bird. And then a couple more birds, another woodpecker, green-barred woodpecker, and then an action shot of a plain parakeet. So then that brings us to our last destination, which was this town of Ubatuba, and we stayed at the Tamambuko Eco Resort, which is a wonderful resort right on the beach and this beautiful lagoon. And Ubatuba is famous for their catchphrase is there are 500 birds and 100 beaches. And it was a great sort of combination of features for our family. The non-birders were very happy to go to the beach, and Adam and I were very happy to go birding. And there are some incredible birding sites very near where we were staying. So unlike a lot of the other spots where we had to drive a long way, here we were able to sort of go 10 minutes away from where we were staying and see some incredible endemics. So that's where Ubatuba is, in these little bays. That's what the resort looks like. And then we went birding with Lucas. He took us to this Fazenda Angelim, which is a very well-known private farm that they give access. These are tobacco plants. And you have these beautiful indigenous forests sort of interspersed through the tobacco plantations. And it's good for birding because the birds actually do enjoy the tobacco plantations. It gives good shade, and the habitat is pretty close to natural forest. So we saw a few good birds. Rufous-capped motmot, it was Adam's first motmot species. Some very, very tough endemics. The photography was really tricky. Bertoni's antbird and this eye-ringed toady tyrant. And then some wonderful tanagers. This is one of my favorite photos, this beautiful flame-crested tanager that we saw. And then I must tell the story of the amazing black-hooded antwren. So black-hooded antwren was a bird that was discovered in the late 1800s and described to science. And shortly after it was discovered, it disappeared not from science, it disappeared. No one could find a black-hooded antwren. And it was not seen for over 100 years until someone found a population of them in 1987. So it was rediscovered in 1987, and this is its eBird map. This is very close to, so obviously you can see Rio here, here's Sao Paulo, and this little bay over here is the only place in the world. It's about sort of 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers square in which black-hooded antwren occurs. So this square probably represents the entire world population of black-hooded antwren, and you can see this township. And so I did research, and I was made aware of a pin over here, which is where the bird is most frequently seen. And there's obviously a population of X number of pairs or whatever it is, and that's where one of the pairs is. And then there's another pin over here, which is another pair. And when we were at Hotel de Ipe, here's the bird guide, Rene Santos, who is one of the better English speakers we came across. Gene said that he looks like George Clooney, and he said that's not the first time he's been told that. So he did the George Clooney sort of eyebrow raise for us. And I've been quite a lot of contact with him after returning. He's a wonderful man. He was guiding these two Alaskan women, and he overheard us talking about the black-hooded antwren, and he said to us, "Are you going to try for it?" Hotel de Ipe is obviously hundreds of kilometers away, but we were on a route that we were going to try for it. We said, "Yeah, we've got the pins," and he said, "Well, it's not such a good idea because this township over here is not great, and there's a road that travels along the river, and they see birders walking along this trail to go to the site, and there've been a lot of very unfortunate mugging incidents where birders have lost their equipment." And so he recommended that we try at this petrol station. There's a petrol station right next to the main road. So this is the main road that comes from Rio. And he said, you park your car and you go into the bush behind there and you try there. So because we were on our way, Jean gave us a 45-minute window while she took the kids to enjoy a cold Coke and an ice cream. And Adam and I headed off into the forest, and we failed. We spent 45 minutes. We saw a few other cool birds, but we missed the black-hooded ant wren. Got in the car, and it was about 2 hours to get to Ubatuba, and I thought that was the last we'd ever try for black-hooded ant wren. So we had a very good day with Lucas on our first day at Ubatuba, and on the second day we went with him. I said to him, would it be realistic to try and see the ant wren, give it one more try? And he said, certainly worth it. So we drove 2 hours back to the site. We actually didn't try at the petrol station, not over here. We went to this site over here, and he walked slowly and listened for the call, and eventually managed to hear a few birds calling, and in these sort of scrubby bits over here, and there was our black-hooded ant wren. So probably one of the most range-restricted birds I've ever seen, if not the most range-restricted bird. Such a tiny area, such an interesting story, but they seem to be surviving, and they seem to, have a reasonably dense population, even though they haven't been seen for so long. So that was the black-hooded ant wren, and then we spent the rest of that morning going to two different sort of lodges, well, lodge and someone's personal home, where there were amazing hummingbird feeders. So this, there are lots of fruit being put out for tanagers, and then they had a whole range of feeders, and we just saw some incredible birds. This is a glittering throated emerald, and also one of my favorite photos from the trip. Just such a pretty bird, and great opportunity to photograph very nice birds. That's the same species, one in flight. And then these beautiful festive coquettes, which are just spectacular little birds. They're probably no bigger than your thumb. So tiny little birds, and really cool to photograph when you get them in focus. This is an endemic hermit. It's a very large hermit, and it's got this beautiful straight bill. Most hermits have got curved bills. If you remember that scaly-throated hermit from earlier, the saw-billed hermit's got an unusually straight bill. And then a whole bunch more hummingbirds. He has versicolored emerald and the somber hummingbird, which is an endemic. And then this was the real special at this particular lodge. It's a frilled coquette, also tiny, about the size of your thumb, about the same size as festive coquette. And it was the main reason we went to that particular lodge, was to see frilled coquette. And then we went to this very famous site called Foloseka, which is a man who's been feeding hummingbirds and tanagers for 30 years. He famously doesn't ask people to pay to visit his residence. He only wants you to take some sugar or some bananas. So we stopped at a store and bought a 10-kilogram bag of sugar, which he uses to replenish his feeders. So this is him. For the life of me, can't remember his name, which is really bad. But he puts all the fruit out, and as you arrive, he fills up the feeders. And unfortunately, we were there midday, and it wasn't a great time. But I've seen videos. You can see there's a tanager over here. But I've seen videos of this whole area. If you look on Instagram and you search Foloseka, you'll see videos of the bird life that comes out and feeds over here. It's just quite incredible. But here were some of the birds and the photographs that we were able to get. Here's a Brazilian ruby. This is the male. Here's a flight shot of a festive coquette. And bearing in mind, this is the size of your thumb. It's quite a difficult task to get the eye nice and sharp. And then here's a violet-capped wood nymph, which is one of the most common hummingbirds that we saw, but you tend to not photograph the common ones, and you focus on photographing the difficult ones, and suddenly you realize you don't have a photo of the really common birds. And then this is a Brazilian tanager. And what was quite interesting, there's only, I think, 4 or 5 birds that have got the word Brazil in them. So it's a Brazilian merganser, which is a kind of duck. It's the Brazilian ruby, and then Brazilian tanager, and then there's 1 or 2 others. And I always like to tell the story of the fact that there could be no better bird to have as Brazil's national bird. It's weirdly not endemic, and the reason it's not endemic is there's a caged bird that was released in this little town in Argentina. So someone obviously had one in a cage and released it, and there's a small population in this town, apparently a very rare population. So you don't easily see them in Argentina, but because of that cage bird that was released, it's no longer endemic to Brazil. But it's pretty much restricted to the Atlantic rainforest. And we hadn't seen a Brazilian tanager for probably, well, for the whole duration of the trip until our second last day. And then obviously they're quite common here in Ubatuba. But I suggest that this bird would be the perfect national bird of Brazil. And sadly, I don't have a photograph of the national bird of Brazil because it's one of those birds that's so common that you don't take a photograph of it. But they picked a rufous-bellied thrush, which is pretty much like our olive thrush. So instead of picking this absolutely spectacular bird as their national bird, they went with basically an olive thrush lookalike, which is basically common as anything. So that's the Brazilian tanager, very cool. And here's some more honey creepers are a type of tanager. So this is a bird that's obviously named after a female. This is the female on the right. And that kind of brings us to the final hurdle. And I'll keep the story brief. I know I've been going on a little bit longer than anticipated, but we had our trip to the airport. We were leaving at 8:30 at night from Sao Paulo airport. So we thought if we do the 3-hour 42 drive along here, we can leave at 12 o'clock, get there at sort of 4 o'clock, miss Sao Paulo, rush hour traffic, should be fine. And then I looked at an alternative route, and you can see instead of traveling along the very slow coastline, you can go up this mountain pass and then get to the big main road a lot quicker, and it's much faster. So I thought, well, let's do that route. So that was my decision. So we turned inland immediately after leaving Ubatuba, and you can see you go up this valley and then up these very windy roads. And when we got onto these windy sections, the road steepened like I've never seen in my life. It was probably a 20% incline of the roads. It was tar, but our little Doblo full with 6 people, having been on the road for 2.5 weeks, luggage on the roof, it started to struggle a little bit around these steep corners. So I was putting it into first gear and around the corner and then letting cars pass. So I pull off onto the side, cars would pass, and then off we'd go again. And at one point I pulled off onto the side of the road, and car passed, and I put it back into first gear, put my foot down, and there was nothing. So the car virtually did not move. And the engine was still running, but there was a smell, and we all got out of the car. Jean panicked, as she often does, from zero to panic in no time at all. She started running up the road saying, well, we can walk up the hill and then I can drive up with no people in the car. But we had no idea how far we had to go before we crested the top of the pass. So you can see lots of hands on hips and puzzlement. But we in the end decided the only way to do this was to go back down the pass and then do this route along the coastline and then cut inland over here. This also worried me a little bit. There was a bit of a mountain pass, but it was much flatter. And the only way to do this was to do a sort of a reverse U-turn. So to let gravity take the car backwards and swing at the same time, which meant Jean had to walk up the road and stop traffic coming from above. Tommy had to walk down the road and stop traffic coming from below. We did the U-turn, put the handbrake up, everyone jumped in the car, and we rolled down the hill, letting the engine cool down and recover. So we managed okay. We got to Sao Paulo, just out the outskirts, and we stopped to fill up the car with petrol, as you do when you have rented a car. And a mechanic opened the hood, and he called me over and he said, you've got big problems, all in Portuguese, obviously, with lots of communicating on the translation app. And it meant we had a close to burnt out engine. He managed to, at the last moment, I think if we had driven another 10 Ks, we would have been in big trouble. He filled the coolant. He filled the engine had no oil left. The coolant had all bubbled over, and we managed to get the car going again and returned it. I said to the kids, jump out of the car and unpack as quickly as you can and hope they don't check. The guy did check under the hood and didn't find any problems. And when we came back to South Africa, I was watching my emails very carefully because obviously they have a hold on your card. And I was waiting for them to tell me that I owed 10,000 reais for an engine replacement. And the one day I got an email from the car rental place, and it was obviously all in Portuguese. So there was a very nerve-wracking moment of copying and pasting this whole email into a translator app, which I eventually discovered was a 120 reais traffic fine, which I paid very quickly. And to this day, I still have not received another email, but it was very close. So the Doblo did amazingly until that very, very last moment that we got there in one piece and everything worked out fine. Okay, so here's a final summary. I'm sorry I've kept you all so long, but this is basically a summary. This is my eBird map. So you can see I've birded in North America, Panama, and Peru. And this was our trip to Brazil. We saw 319 species. 189 of those were lifers for me, which is just an incredible haul, particularly given that I've birded in South America already. We had 295 livers for Adam, which was, I guess, not that surprising, his first time in South America. 49 endemics, and I really should change this presentation and talk about this bird. It's an incredible endemic. It's called a buff-throated purple tuft, and we saw it once. It's incredibly rare, very range restricted. We saw it in Ubatuba itself, and yeah, very difficult to photograph. Absolutely tiny. It's probably the size of it's actually smaller than a Cape pendulum tit, so smaller than our smallest bird. So very special. But 49 endemics is a huge proportion of endemic species. I saw 2 new bird families, the Seriema and the wood quail, and bird families is something that I'm super interested in. So the more I can see, the better. We saw 19 hummingbird species, as the Brazilian ruby, 16 raptors and owls. This is a snail kite. 5 toucans. This is the spot-billed toucanet. 12 woodpeckers. Here's my wonderful woodpecker. Blonde-crested woodpecker, this great antshrike. There were 22 anthingies, that's ant wrens and antbirds. 25 phenorids, including the streaked xenops. 46 tyrant flycatchers. It's not the largest bird family in the world for nothing. You see tyrant flycatchers everywhere, and they're very different. This is a very showy boat-billed flycatcher. And then 39 tanager species, including this wonderful flame-crested tanager. And then our top 10, and I'll quickly go through this. This list changes every day. So I might think differently tomorrow about this. Tawny-browed owl, the robust woodpecker, Itachi, spine-tail, bar-deemed tanager, black-cheeked gnat-eater, the frilled coquette, the red-ruffed fruit crow, buff-throated purple tuft, black-hooded ant wren, and then everyone knows this one will never change, our bird of the trip being our black and gold Katinga. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. This is us on Ipanema Beach. Here's the family over here, enjoying a beautiful evening in Rio. So an amazing, amazing trip. And thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions. I'll allow you to unmute. Let me just do that. I can Yes, so if you would like to ask any questions, maybe just let me know and I'll unmute you in the chat room, but you don't feel